St. Hedwig's, in the month of June, roses climbed and spilt over trellises and porch rails like gossip eager to be heard. The village lay in a slumber beneath a gentle sun, and the Dower House, with its ivy-covered walls and perch just off the green, exuded an air of serene beauty. Miss Marple had received her invitation that morning in a handwritten note, and lavender was the perfect accompaniment. "Come have tea with us in the garden at 4. Evelyn and Cordelia would be delighted to have you." Major Thomas Evely's widow, Evely had a steely backbone and a sharp tongue that was sweet to hear sharp if you weren't paying attention. She had owned the Dower House since the Major passed away 10 years ago, and her speciality was serving carefully selected tea in the garden, which her station ensured. Just before 4 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived, and the maid, sensing her uncertain curtsy, led her out into the manicured garden, where linen-covered tables sparkled and mismatched porcelain cups caught the light. Cordelia, dressed in a pale lavender dress, presided like a queen among the hydrangeas, and Edwin Peake stood tall among the flowers, charming, unmarried, and obviously unprepared for Cordelia's social game. The new doctor at the hamlet meets Mrs. Fiona Hargrave, who lives down the path and looks like someone who is perpetually on the verge of sharing a secret with the Reverend. Miss Marple's chair had been placed carefully, half-shaded downwind of the honeysuckle. Cordelia believed in comfort, if not warmth, and Mabel, who was sunburnt and frequently flustered by Mrs. Harrove's irreverent jokes, was Florence Evely's niece, a young woman who was incredibly fragile and who habitually apologized before speaking. "I hope the scones were edible." With a well-rehearsed sigh, Cordelia said as the dishes were passed around, "Cook's new girl is exceedingly frightened still. We must give the young a chance. Nothing a dab of strawberry jam can't solve." Florence's hands quivered a little as she poured the tea. "She gets a little anxious in social situations," Cordelia greeted her with a warm grin, though she couldn't help but show a hint of impatience. "It's heartbreaking that the lamb's mother passed away at such a young age." A sparrow fluttered over the hedge. "I've never seen so many bees." Mrs. Hargrave mumbled under her breath as she fanned herself. "I swear there's a swarm in the orchard." I lean forward, grin at Florence, and you appear slightly flushed. "Dear Miss Evely, possibly in excess of sunlight." Florence smiled and said, "I'm fine. Maybe I was just exhausted when I told her earlier the girls were virtually see-through when..." Cordelia interrupted to say that she wants meat. Miss Marple closely watched everything unfold, her curiosity piqued. There was an aura of intrigue, as if the lace had been overly starched or the performance had been overstaged. Rumors about the upcoming village fair, the price of strawberries this season, and the mysterious new lodger in the vicarage's side cottage kept the tea going smoothly until just before 6 o'clock, when chairs were being pushed back and friendly goodbyes were being exchanged, that the incident occurred. "Cordelia." Florence grabbed Aunt Cordelia's arm as Evely, who had stood up to see her guests depart, stumbled and fell to her knees. Cordelia let out a low sound as her teacup fell from her grasp. Her lips moved once, but no one could understand what she was saying. Then, surrounded by a rustle of silken sun hats, she collapsed, her body engulfed in a flurry of activity. Dr. Peake hurried over to her side, allowing her to lie still while he calculated, while Mrs. Hargrave retrieved cold water. Miss Marple, however, had already moved to Cordelia's other side, where she placed 2 fingers gently on her neck. Her pulse had stopped beating, so she whispered something softly. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the garden, disrupting the tranquilly. Bees buzzed. The scones sat half-eaten, and the Dower House tea party devolving into Marple, stood up, delicately stroking her skirt. As she leaned to retrieve a shard of porcelain, she noticed a subtle imprint on the edge, suggesting that the shattered teacup was not an accident after all. Rather, something was deeply off. Chapter 2. A sinister tale that defies solitude upon the arrival of the ambulance from markets. Ledbury, the Lady Cordelia Eve's body, had been respectfully covered with a monogrammed linen cloth, and the guests had drifted into stunned silence beneath the rose arbor. Miss Marple sat apart from the others on a low bench near the trellis, her hands calmly folded around her handbag. She wasn't praying, nor was she grieving, not yet. She was thinking quietly, thoroughly, and with that peculiar discipline of mind that allowed her to recall in crisp detail the precise order in which the tea had been poured. Dr. Peake spoke first. No sign of trauma. She just dropped it. Could be the heart or a stroke. His tone was professional, but a faint edge of something, defensiveness perhaps, lurked beneath. Ms. Marple gave a gentle nod. She was robust for her age, certainly active. She played croquet only last Tuesday, and quite viciously. Florence, still pale, sat rigid at the garden table, untouched tea cooling beside her. She blinked rapidly, hands clasped too tightly in her lap. She didn't seem unwell this morning. She whispered she was her usual self. Mrs. Hargrave sniffed audibly. Mark my words, she kept complaining about the glare and the bees perhaps. She had an allergy. Some people swell right up, you know, Reverend. Merton looked uncomfortable. Let's not speculate. The Lord will reveal what is meant to be known. The constable, a young man with a nervous mustache, and the ambulance had arrived. Rafferty spoke with quiet uncertainty as he stared at him politely, but said nothing. Dr. Peake, you'll need to record the time of death, about 6 or 4 by my watch, Rafferty said, his voice barely audible. You'll provide a cause for now, natural causes. Of course, we'll need the coroner. The attention of Miss Marple once again slipped to the linen fabric. Nearby, on the grass, stood Cordelia's hat, which had mysteriously been unharmed by the fall. A shattered porcelain cup glistened at the spot where the tea had leaked, and there was still a small steam coming from it. The lip of the cup was stained with a shade that was too dark to be milked. Darjeeling Rafferty coughed awkwardly and turned to face Cordelia. She said, I saw it happen. When we got up to leave, she hesitated, but she hadn't complained before. Were you seated next to her? Miss Marple. Although Miss Marple didn't say it directly, Cordelia was not the type of lady to confess to having weaknesses. Florence's voice quivered as she mentioned the scones being heavy. I didn't give them much thought, because she was always critical. Miss Marple turned her head slightly and drank from the cup you poured. Florence nodded as if ashamed, but truthfully. She poured all the tea. No one is blaming her, my dear. Miss Marple whispered something, but Mrs. Hargrave had already leaned forward. It's strange, isn't it? If it were the tea or something in it, surely we'd all be unwell, right? If you don't mind, I'd like to accept the china from Miss Marple, who mentioned that only 1 cup was damaged. According to Dr. Peake, it is common practice to submit samples to the Ledbury Coroner's Lab as soon as possible. Police Officer Rafferty paused for a moment before nodding in agreement. Mrs. Herov, who had been silently snorting, suddenly appeared quite thorough. As the tea was served, Dr. Peake's shoulders received more attention than they had previously. Later that evening, in her cottage, surrounded by rosebud scents and the sound of a ticking clock, Miss Marple made note of this. Without drama, but with the same calmness, Miss Marple recounted the events of the day, on her knitting needles. She slipped Cordelia Everleigh had complete control over the Dower House, from the guest list to the table settings to her niece's posture. There were invisible lines that no one crossed, and Miss Marple was certain that Cordelia had been poisoned. The poisoning had been done subtly, with precision, and nobody would know how or why. Mrs. Hargrave was good at gossip, but murder seemed too theatrical for her. Reverend Merton was quiet, repressed, and vaguely embarrassed. He might be hiding a personal failure or secret sin. However, Dr. Peake was professional and overly quick to take charge. Florence, with her delicate, thorn-like personality, had poured the tea, but Miss Marple noticed that her hands were trembling with nervousness, not because of any malice or malicious intent, rather than because of the tea itself. The solution, it turned out, lay in the structure of the afternoon. Miss Marple stood up, her joints groaning slightly, and retrieved her diary, where she turned to the page for today and started writing the Dower House guest list. The following is the order of events. C.E. host, niece, Dr. E.P., Mrs. F.H., Reverend. S.M. self, 356 tea, 405 scones. Criticism, largely mundane talk, bees, an FHS note. While Cordelia was standing, there was a shattered teacup on the rim, and Dr. P. took the evidence away. Florence, who was visibly distressed and unsure of herself, hesitated before writing, Cordelia, in her experience. A murder that looks like a fainting spell is rarely a coincidence. In another paragraph, Florence addressed giving young people a chance, which is neither too much nor too little. Chapter 3. The following morning. The hamlet of St. Hedwig's awoke to the aroma of damp roses and the subtle unease that accompanies. A death that was too abrupt to provide solace. The sun shone through the partially drawn curtains, not out of sadness but curiosity, and by 10 o'clock the post office had transformed into a centre of subdued speculation. Collapsed, murmured Mr. Toller as he folded a newspaper he hadn't finished reading. In her garden, the unfortunate lady stood with her tea still in her hand. She wasn't that old, and poor counted Mrs. Blythe, who had not been invited and would never forgive, added insult to injury. 69, maybe 70, fit as a fiddle, if a touch too proud of her rosebeds, a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a grey cardigan and skirt, approached the door and gently knocked. The woman was respectful but unobtrusive, her dark hair pinned with quiet care, and her eyes were behind rimless glasses. Miss Marple, who was purchasing a single stamp for a letter that didn't require immediate attention, listened without interruption, placed the stamp in her purse, smiled politely, and returned to her morning stroll, rather than returning home. She continued down a narrow lane that wound behind the church and curving towards the vicarage. At the end of this tidy gravel path stood a small side cottage, whitewashed and shy, with a lavender bush pressed against the window. According to Mrs. Hargrave, the cottage had recently acquired a tenant. "Hi, I'm Miss Marple," Miss Marple exclaimed with a smile. "Jane Marple from the High Street. I think you've taken over the Victor's side cottage." The woman was hesitant. "But I moved in last week. My name is Ellie Lenina Carter, and this is a lovely, tranquil little place. I knew the previous owner, Mrs. Alatin, and she had a cat problem. I hope the smell hasn't stayed. It's not pleasant. I hope you're settling in well. Unfortunately, the village isn't as tranquil as I had hoped." Mrs. Ivley's demeanour changed. Abruptly, I'd only met her briefly at the grocery store, but she appeared to be fairly exact. Miss Marple asked gently, "Do you know her niece, Florence?" "I saw her last Sunday at church, and she seemed completely disoriented." The tone was one of observation, but we often hope that new individuals bring fresh eyes to see more than old ones, and Miss Marple smiled faintly as she said, "Well, I won't keep you." I'm just being curious about you as a neighbor." While visiting the Dare residence, Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued but left unfulfilled. The curtains remained drawn. Miss Carter cocked her head slightly to consider possible possibilities. Florence, a guy with close-cropped hair, clean cuffs, and a voice so precise it might slice paper, sat across from Aveli at the breakfast table. The man's eyes were red, but he had not grieved. The bread and tea were left unfinished. "Mr. Basil Layton, Solicitor Cordelius. I've contacted the coroner. According to him, a preliminary examination will occur tomorrow morning. Until then, nothing can be formally certified." He continued to nod, and he also nodded. "After reviewing the will that your aunt had last modified 5 months ago, Mrs. Hargrave receives a bequest in addition to the house and its contents, a modest annuity, and 3 charities. You are the principal benefactor, as you probably anticipated. A yearly payment of £25 for Rose Society service." Ezel scowled at Mrs. Hargrave, who she despised. Even though she was extremely fair, Mr. Layton did permit her to flash a thin smile. "I anticipate that Mr. Forbes will raise concerns." "I am not familiar with Mr. Forbes or any investment advisor." Florence scowled. Florence glanced down at her unfinished toast and wondered why she had never brought up her accountant, who said she had hired him for a short time to assess the trust's assets last year. She fired him in January. "Dear Miss Evely, with unexpected deaths come unexpected questions, so please exercise caution in the days ahead." Florence raised her eyes to meet the man's. "You believe she was murdered?" Instead of responding, Layton stood up, buttoned his coat, and then continued, "My job is not to speculate, Miss Evely, but I've learnt that money does not die quietly." Layton greeted Miss Marple with a polite wave as they walked past the garden gate this morning. "I hope you're not delivering bad news, only the legal kind." A poison-tasting grin was Leon's offering. "Occasionally, Miss Marple's taste is lacking, and he leaves when it's too late." As Miss Marple made her way down the garden path, she noticed that the table from yesterday was empty and the broken cup had been removed. However, she could still feel an eerie echo in the air, as if it were the final note of a chord hummed softly in the background. In the doorway, Florence stood with her arms crossed, and she whispered, "I couldn't sleep because I kept hearing the teacup break over and over again. It's like grief doing what it can't undo. They believe I did it. Do you believe you did it?" Florence's eyes were filled with an unfiltered emotion. Florence recoiled as I poured the tea. Many people do this, but even fewer comprehend the significance of timing, chance, or reason. Yet I would have had to have, with a kind touch. Miss Marple held her hand and said, "My darling, guilt is not logic. If we are careful, we can free you from both." Florence delicately encircled Miss Marple's fingers as she said, "They're coming for the will. I wanted the house and the money, but I didn't know. Although someone else may have agreed with Miss Marple's sections for arriving at lunchtime, the coroner's demeanor was formal, and his questioning were procedural. Florence stayed inside pique, along with clinical detachment providing exact times and professional terminology, followed the test. The death certificate won't be released until the toxicology results are back. By afternoon, the air at Dower House was thick with suspicion. The garden that had exuded charm the day before had been swept clean, and the furniture had been brought. Back inside, the shattered china washed away, leaving behind only the bewildered and restless bees huddled around the lilacs. Miss Marple had tea with an old acquaintance, Mrs. Lavinia Winthrop, who was a former headmistress and knew everyone's business if not always accurately. Lavinia had an enemy, though Cordelia was thought of as very respectable, but she had burned a few bridges. As she stirred her tea, Miss Marple didn't bother to look up the gardener, Jasper, whom she had dismissed last month on accusations of stealing gloves. No one had proven it, but she had sent him packing without a reference. It was nasty business, and he wasn't quite right. Poor Jasper lives with his father, who drinks like a sailor and yells at clouds. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Gloves, a rather a curious thing to steal, small, intimate. Well, Cordelia was always odd about her possessions. Remember that piano stool she locked with a chain? I do, miss. Marple didn't press further. Instead, she quietly pocketed the name Jasper, Guff tucking it away for later. Later that day, Constable Rafferty appeared at Miss Marple's gate, hat in hand, and dust on his boots. He looked as if he'd walked a moral mile, and wasn't sure he'd arrived just for a moment. Of course, Mr. Rafferty. The geraniums won't mind the delay. He hesitated on the threshold of her cottage. I've got a question, or maybe more, a worry. Sit, please. He did, perching on the edge of the armchair like a schoolboy summoned by the head. Mistress, it's the teacup, he began. Dr. Peake said he'd submit it for analysis, but I don't want to cast aspersions on him since he's a doctor, but his apparent agitation is bothering me. He reddened as Miss Marple whispered, You have good instincts, Constable. Use them. Did you suspect he was hiding something? I believe everyone does. Who cares whether it matters, and what does it even mean? Rachel acknowledged with a nod that there is one additional item. An unscenting letter was discovered on Cordelia's writing desk. It was addressed to a Mr. Emery Forbes. Does that name hold any significance for you? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with intense concentration as her solicitor brought it up. The letter explained that the investment advisor had reconsidered a decision she had made last autumn, and was ready to resume their discussions. Seems a little stuffy for a personal message, do you think? Rafferty ran her fingers over the paper, which had a subtle aroma of ink and lavender. Dear Mr. Forbes, after much consideration, Miss Marple read in silence. Please do not react by postal mail. I will be in touch with details soon. I think I may have been too hasty in October, but your unique suggestions have turned out to be sound. I would like to resume our arrangement discreetly. Cordelia, she never sent it, ever. 2 or 3 days ago, Miss Marple contemplated discretionary financial reversal time, and now she has passed away. My guest had questioned about the missing stamp in the drawer. Isn't it strange how it has the ability to? Mrs. Marple mentioned the possibility of motivation. It is imperative that we discover Mr. Forbes' identity and the reasons behind his dismissal. Later that night, Florence paced restlessly through the home, her footfall muted by Persian carpets. The air was heavy with both the sadness of the loss and the spectre of Cordelia's curse. Her fragrance persisted in the drawing room. While Florence was in the study, she stopped at the writing desk to stare at the chair. Then she opened a lower drawer and found a small, leather-bound ledger. Florence frowned because Cordelia never left books lying around, and certainly not ledgers. A guest updated the distribution of money from Rutland Trust 8 months ago on the first page. Florence's allowance was transferred to E's discretionary development account without prior notice. As Florence continued to scan through the notes, her throat clenched at the sight of shared distribution references and figures she didn't quite get. Yet her name occurred multiple times, always in relation to deductions, and finally a concluding line. In December, before the annual audit, Florence had sealed the books with a handshake from Forbes Surly. He was involved, but why had Cordelia touched Florence's allowance? She had always claimed she was putting it aside for a decent future. Chapter 5 begins with Florence taking the ledger upstairs, covering it in a shawl and hiding it beneath a floorboard in her closet. She still didn't trust anyone, but she was starting to get a clue about something she hadn't dared to consider before. Someone had been stealing from Cordelia. Some of the loudest secrets can be found in the most unexpected locations, according to Miss Marple's long-held belief. As the next morning's church bell rang, Em climbed down from the hedge and scribbled the name of Emery Forbes onto the top line of her notepad. This was not her first visit to the village archives. She had gone there once before to uncover evidence that the former schoolmaster had fabricated his war medals. With her scarf tucked into her coat, she made her way to the small, seldom used room above the old town hall, where records lay dormant and secrets slept. Unexpectedly, the results caught her. Basil Layton, the solicitor, looked askance as he passed Miss Marple and Florence at the Dower House. The man who entered was neither tall nor short, but his presence filled the foyer. He wore a city-tailored suit and polished shoes. As he passed by, he seemed to evaluate the value of every object. He asked, "Yes, Emery Forbes, I believe your aunt and I had financial dealings. I was summoned regarding some estate matters." Florence hesitated. "I wasn't told you were coming." Rumors spread by Mr. Layton. Florence stepped aside as Layton strode past her, as if he'd already owned the place. Miss Marple, who hadn't heard about the visit but wasn't slacking off, spoke to Mr. Basil Layton again that afternoon. She found him outside his law office, getting into his Bentley. She called out to him, "Layton, forgive me for intruding." And he paused. "I have something I can help you with. I just wanted to know how well I knew." Mr. Emery Forbes Layton straightened out. "I once recommended him. He was introduced to me by a colleague in London, and he claimed to have extensive experience in discreetly managing estates. Cordelia consulted with him for about 4 months before letting him go. I respected her decision, but I couldn't understand why Layton seemed so concerned. She was very careful, and if she suspected mismanagement, she would have spoken up. Instead, Layton seemed to be studying her, which made no sense. Per our agreement, I am here to ensure that all records of our transactions are accounted for." The man's voice was smooth and self-assured. He mentioned that Cordelia had some remaining interests that require verification. I was unaware of any remaining interests. Miss Marple smiled lightly as she spoke. The man was inside the Dower House. Sitting across from Forbes in the drawing room, Florence spoke with great attention, having slanted his head. Forbes said, "I have her note, if you like. It's word for word with the letter Florence saw yesterday, but printed on clean, crisp paper with no scent of lavender and no ink blots. This was a copy, not the original, but it was identical to the letter." Florence remained silent, her pupils narrowing slightly, as Forbes returned the letter to his folder. Cordelia was known for her thoughtfulness, loyalty, and subtlety, and I have no doubt that there was a suggestion or test behind those words. Despite this, for some reason, Forbes's smile never reached his eyes. Regardless, he stood up straight. As a nun, and Florence waited for the door to close before rushing upstairs to retrieve the ledger. It was then that she started to realize that someone had lied to her aunt. According to Cordelia's solicitor Layton, Constable Rafferty visited Miss Marple and cautiously glanced at her cat as it crept nervously around the rug, saying, "Found something strange. 3 substantial payments occurred last year, but none of them went to her account. Instead, one of them went to a shell company, Hare's." Miss Marple inquired of her Layton and Forbes met in person 3 times before Cordelia ever did. They weren't just acquaintances, they were partners. Miss Marple folded her hands, and now Cordelia is dead. The recipient listed for the transfer is EF Associates, which is strange because it has the same initials but no physical address or office. Despite this, it seems very real. I asked Leighton about it, and he got defensive, saying it was a standard investment vehicle. People love to use words that conceal more than they reveal. At the very moment that she started to doubt the wisdom of that deal, Rafferty nodded in agreement, and Miss Marple stood up from her seat and walked over to her desk. From the little journal she had been keeping in the days leading up to Cordelia's death, she drew a thin line and scribbled 2 names beneath it. E. Forbes and the words discretion, stealing, and fabrication. Be the motivation for Leon to gain access to funds. A lady like Cordelia could change her opinion so subtly, she whispered as she tapped the pencil against the page. They thought she was predictable, but they were wrong. Section 6. The rain began to fall as the sun rose, gradually becoming heavier and more persistent. It soaked the hedges and streaked the Dower House windows in steady rivets. The world seemed to be holding its breath under the weight of the wet earth, which made people stay indoors and reflect. What was most important was that the rain brought certain secrets to light, where an observer could see them wriggling to escape. Miss Marple waited until 9:30 before she knocked on the kitchen door of the Dower House. She suspected that the young maid, Ivy Curnow, would be sorting breakfast dishes. Miss Marple. Poor Ivy blinked in surprise, clutching a tea towel. "Oh, I wasn't expecting anyone. I won't keep you long." Miss Marple said kindly, "Just a few moments of your time." Ivy hesitated, then led her inside, where the warmth of the oven met the damp scent of bleach. The girl was no more than 17, with freckles, soft hands, and the guarded expression of someone unused to being asked anything but orders. Miss Marple sat at the edge of the kitchen table. "You were serving at the garden tea, were you not? I brought the scones and set the cups." "Yes, and you saw who drank." "Would I think so, ma'am? Did you notice anything odd, a moment out of place, perhaps?" Ivy twisted the towel. "Well, there was something just before tea. I was fetching the sugar bowl from the pantry. Mrs. Evely was particular about her lumps, and I saw Dr. Peake in the kitchen. Said he was looking for the loo, but he was near the teacups." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle near them. "How it looked like he was checking something, but when I came in, he stepped back real quick, looked a bit flushed. You told no one. I didn't want to be rude. He's the doctor, of course." Miss Marple smiled, stood, and touched the girl's arm lightly. "You've been very helpful, Ivy, and very brave that same hour in the solicitor's office." Mr. Battle Leighton burned a letter, not dramatically, not with trembling hands. Just a match struck a page, folded the slow curl of flame in the metal ashtray. The letter had arrived that morning. Kim signed, typed a single line. She found the ledger. The girl knows. Leighton leaned back in his chair, smoke curling behind him. If Florence had the ledger, then time was shorter than he'd hoped. Back at the Dower House, Florence stood at the window of Cordelia's old bedroom. She'd avoided the room until now, but something had drawn her in curiosity. Perhaps, or the strange magnetism of grief when it seeks proof of absence. She opened the wardrobe. Slowly rows of neatly hung garments greeted her. Pastel blouses, a mothballs scented shawl, and the lavender dress Cordelia had worn to the tea. It had been cleaned, returned, and hung without ceremony. Then she noticed the narrow wooden shelf at the back, hidden behind a loose flap of lining. Inside, folded carefully, was a thin sheath of paper, not handwritten, typed. The money that were removed from the Legacy Trust have been redirected through secure channels, as per the agreement that Florence laid out in a secret memorandum from F. Associates to C. Evely Ray regarding the location of domestic holdings. Disclosure is not recommended at this time. If additional questions come up, we suggest attributing changes to market restructuring or discretionary relocation. After reviewing it, Florence read it twice, then a third time, but they still took her inheritance. Cordelia agreed, saying that it couldn't be possible unless she hadn't understood what she was signing. In an instant, Florence's heart began to pound, and she knew she needed to talk to someone who could explain everything. On the other hand, Miss Marple had already planned her way to Dr. Peake's surgery. A neat receptionist welcomed her with a hint of surprise, saying, "Peake is in with a patient." The tiny office was next to the pharmacy, and inside it was peaceful. "I'll wait," Miss Marple said, settling into a worn leather chair. 10 minutes later, he came out of hiding. When he saw her, he froze. "Doctor, I would like to speak with you, not as a patient, but as a witness." He hesitated, then pointed to the examination room. With her hands folded, she turned to face him. "You were in the kitchen of the Dower House before tea," he said. His eyes briefly flickered. "Yes, searching for the washroom, but, as she pointed out, it was right near the back door." The jaw of Peake clenched. "Madame Marple, what are you trying to say?" "All I'm saying is that you had a chance, and according to young Ivy, you took advantage of it." Cordelia had a hard time keeping her mouth shut, and she hinted multiple times that she would mess with my practice, so I figured she must know something. What could that be? Pete paused to clarify that his credentials are legitimate. "If you're wondering, I was fired from my last position due to a covert misdiagnosis involving an elderly patient. Fortunately, the patient recovered, but her family created quite a scandal. And Cordelia discovered the truth she had warned me all along. A man with mistakes should tread lightly." "So you were careful not to step on her teacup," Miss Marple said, tilting her head. "Yes, she was a challenging woman, but I didn't murder her. I did no such thing," she said with an increasingly severe tone. Marple absorbed his stare. As the twilight descended upon the downs, I prayed that the autopsy would confirm upon. Reaching Miss Marple's cottage, Florence revealed her knowledge by holding up the paper and whispering about the money, about everything. "They stole it from her and from me. My darling, the murder wasn't merely personal, it was prophylactic." Miss Marple studied the memo intently, and when she looked up, her voice was silent. The rain had stopped the following morning, leaving the cobblestones of St. Hedwig shiny and wet under a pale sky. The town was silent, as if chatter had escalated into accusations within her hut. Wearing her spectacles low on her nose, as she did when reading not only words but implications, Miss Marple placed the typed memorandum next to the ledger that Florence had handed. "Two distinct dangers, one monetary and the other lethal, an unnamed firm, an untraceable individual, and a solicitor who carelessly destroyed client documents are all connected by the same name. Ephus." The handwritten remarks in the ledger were traced by Miss Marple's fingertip. Cordelia's little but forceful handwriting started off with simple notations like dates, values, dividends, and the like, but it soon moved to include question marks next to certain numbers. During the March consultation with EF1, entry stuck out among the others that had been crossed out in red. The word amend needs to be changed because Restal's annuity reduction was not communicated to E-Things was Cordelia's intention to correct things. The motive was no longer unclear. It was mathematical avarice masquerading as strategy advice. But murder still required opportunity, nerve, and maybe something else. So Miss Marple leaned back and folded her palms. Panic. Pell stayed in the upstairs rooms of the Dower House that morning. She hadn't spoken to Leighton since finding the memo, and she hadn't responded to Forbes' subtly suggested second meeting either. She didn't feel safe, and her nerves were raw and sharper than they had ever been. Fear had made her watchful, and something strange had occurred. In Cordelia's writing desk, where the unsent letter had been discovered, the drawer had slid open without resistance when Florence first opened it. Cordelia had never left it that way, and nobody had ever gone through it after her death, searching for that letter or the ledger or both constables. While this was going on, Rafferty had finally heard back from the man whose real name he had informed Miss Marple that afternoon Emery Forbes under his alias. He had glanced around just in case they had overheard. In 1952, Henry Felix Crowe, who had been disbarred for fraud as an accountant, served his sentence. Switched names twice since Crowe, and Miss Marple's gentle repetition was a good pick. Carthus pursues the lifeless Rafferty as he skulks from mansion to mansion, aiming for his prey. Miss Marple claimed that he failed to disappear fast enough, and Cordelia Eveley might have been the first to notice. Rafferty paused before adding, "Forbes Crowe left the village this morning. An older woman with complex holdings often employs a shell corporation. We only found out after he had already left that the address he gave for his business in Ledbury doesn't exist. So we can only assume that he knows Florence found the ledger." Miss Marple tapped her cane lightly on the ground, and Rafferty scowled. "Do you think he'll return?" Even though it wasn't signed, Florence recognized the style. Dry, precise, and economical with words. Men like Mr. Crowe always return, especially when they leave something behind and don't want to be found out. "Florence should talk to you about the full situation because you don't understand. Arrive on my own behind the old well in Warbler's Lane at 8 p.m. Florence considered ripping it up, burning it, or just ignoring it after reading it 3 times. Nevertheless, at precisely 10 minutes after 7, she folded it and placed it in her coat pocket. Miss Marple showed up suddenly at the Dower House, and Florence, with her coat drawn and asking if she was going somewhere, answered the door with a smile. Miss Marple asked, "I was just needing some air. Maybe I'll go for a walk with you." Florence seemed taken aback. "I doubt Miss Marple looked directly into her eyes when she handed you a message." I had to know what he meant, so Miss Marple delicately continued after Florence said nothing. "He's attempting to scare you into silence or fear, or both. We have to know," Miss Marple continued in a low but determined voice, "but not on his terms." Miss Marple read the note, nodded once, and then said, "You won't be going?" Florence cautiously reached for her pocket, and the girl placed the note inside. Flora's pupils dilated as she said, "But if I don't, he'll think you came." At 8 o'clock in the evening, the only sound on Warbler's Lane was the rustle of leaves in the wind. The ground sloped gently, covered in moss. A cautious, methodical figure wearing gloves and toting a small, precise object in his coat stepped past the oak tree. "Line, stop where you are," said the low but forceful voice of Constable Raffet from the shadows. There was a slow, bitter smirk from the man as he stood motionless, with neither police taking a step forward. "Never thought the girl had what it took," he whispered. "She didn't," Miss Marple said, emerging behind him, "but I did back at her cottage that night." Miss Marple poured herself a small glass of sherry. She didn't raise it in triumph nor sigh in relief. She merely sat beside the ticking clock and watched the condensation fade from the window pane. There was still one piece missing. Forbes or Crowe had not acted alone. Someone else had known. Cordelia was about to amend her financial plans. Someone local, someone trusted, and that someone had provided. Crowe not only access but timing. The poison in the cup had not come from afar. It had come from someone already inside the garden. Chapter 8. News of Emery Forbes' arrest, or Henry Crow, as the constable now properly called him, spread through St. Hedwig. By the next morning, like steam through a kettle, most villagers knew only that the man was not who he said he was. That was enough for the gossip to boil, but Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of black currant jam and a copy of the Daily Telegraph, knew what still lingered unspoken. Crow may have orchestrated the fraud, but he had not acted alone in murder. The poison had been placed with precision and timing and knowledge of where Cordelia would sit, who would pour for her, and when the moment would come. Crow had not been at the garden table that day. Someone else had arranged for his silence to take effect before he could be exposed, and Miss Marple knew exactly where to look next. The law offices of Basil Leighton were quiet at 11 o'clock when Miss Marple entered. The receptionist gave her a weary glance, but offered no protest. The solicitor was alone in his study, window open, eyes on a thin manila file. When he saw her, he stood slowly. Miss Marple, he flashed a stiff smile and motioned toward a chair. I was wondering what I owed the honor, Cordelia, in regards to her last instructions and the mystery of who exactly granted Henry Crow access to her financial documents. No one ever expects a visit this morning, but sometimes the truth does slip through the cracks. As Leighton furrowed his brow, he knew that you had recommended him, and that money had been transmitted through a shell company. He also knew that Cordelia had changed her mind, albeit privately, sufficiently to compose a letter. She retrieved the typed memorandum from her purse. This was stashed away in Cordelia's wardrobe. I think she got it right before she passed away. Leighton carefully red-foiled it, which makes me think she was about to reveal something. Miss Marple didn't say anything, but I think she was poisoned. The person who did it needed two things: access to her estate's legal files, and the assurance that Florence would be held responsible. Leighton's jaw tightened. Florence C. poured the tea that was to be her inheritance. She was vulnerable, withdrawn, and quick to accuse. Cordelia was domineering, to be sure, but she wasn't stupid. If she was planning to eliminate Crow, she would have notified someone, maybe her solicitor, not Florence. Leighton finally spoke up after a lengthy silence, saying, "You're cleverer than you appear. I make a study of people." She didn't explicitly state that she had changed her mind, but I could tell by her tone and the questions she asked about old ledgers and contracts, things she never used to bother with. I knew what was coming, so you chose to act first. Leighton stood with an even voice, tapping twice on the mahogany edge of the desk. Had she been disbarred, she would have sewed everything. And all this for the sake of being clever with funds which she never even noticed had grown. Miss Marple, unwavering gaze told you to contact Crow, warn him, arrange for poison, and I never touched the cup. On the other hand, you hired a quiet, untrained, easily manipulated person, someone who could be distracted or set up to be blamed if questions arose. Leighton said nothing, and Miss Marple persisted. You knew Florence, you relied on Cordelia's rapid fall to save the ledger, but Leighton's gradual exhalation revealed that the book had survived. I should have burnt it when I had the chance. You had plenty of opportunities, but murder is murder, and there are no corrections. As policeman Rafferty showed up at the gate with his shoulders squared, he took Leighton into custody. Instead of resisting, Leighton simply straightened his cuffs and requested his coat. As he passed Miss Marple by the gate, he halted to ask for it, and she smiled slightly in sorrow. Everyone loses in these situations, Mr. Leighton. All we do is stop another disaster. Florence and Miss Marple sat in the garden of the Dower House. Later that evening, a single lantern flickering between them. The house feels different now, Florence said, her hands mysteriously covering her cup. "It will, in time, belong to you. I don't want the money, then give it away. But know the truth first." As Florence slowly nodded, "He made use of me after." A period of quiet. Florence finally spoke up, asking, "You knew all along, didn't you, that it wasn't me, that it was never as simple as a girl pouring tea?" Chapter 9 saw the arrest of Battle-Laden, which sent shivers down St. Hedwig's spine that no summer sun could cure. It wasn't just that he'd killed a woman. It was that he'd done it with manners, polite, smiling, and, predictably, respectability had crumbled. Despite this, Miss Marple, as ever, remained composed in the midst of the storm because she knew something was still missing. Proof that poison had been prepared. An indisputable motive, but the exact method by which the substance had entered. The Lady Cordelia nothing was resolved about Eve's cup because Leighton wasn't there, and the maid, Ivy Kernow, saw only nervous movement. Like knitting, Miss Marple returned to the subject with patience and memory, and she knew that in a community like St. Hedwig's, the vicarage venerable, memory might be found in one place above all others. In a whitewashed parsonage nestled between the churchyard and a row of ash trees, Mabel led a simple life. "I guess this isn't a spiritual visit. I'm not sure, but clarity frequently borders on divine." Miss Marple called around 4, right as he was making his second cup of tea. She took his tea and sat down with him in the study, a room filled with theological texts and abandoned mezznals. The rain splattered lightly on the windows, adding to the Reverend's soft, rhythmic voice. "I'd like you to recall the tea party at the Dower House," she said, her face contorted into a grimace. "I wonder if you remember the serving of the tea itself." It was obvious that she was pale and awkward with the cups, but Cordelia handed mine directly, and so did Mrs. Hargrave. Dr. Peake may have passed his own cup to Cordelia, while Reverend Merton paused and carefully placed his own on the tray. Miss Marple looked up at him, and you nodded slowly. Florence poured each cup, and Cordelia was busy talking to Ivy about something, so I took mine and passed it on to her. He didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, so he shook his head, said, "No, there wasn't a switch." He reached across and brushed a sleeve against something, opened and closed his mouth, and finally said, "What's wrong?" Reverend Merton cleared his throat, and Mrs. Hargrave took a seat. Although Cordelia insisted on drinking her tea unsweetened, Mrs. Hargrave insisted on adding sugar nonetheless. Cordelia became angry and remarked something along the lines of, "I haven't changed my ways overnight." Perhaps someone else was hoping that Miss Marple had, with her rustling housecoat, sharp eyes hidden beneath tinted spectacles. Mrs. Fiona Hargrave answered the door to her spacious, brick-filled, hydrangea-filled, and financially unsustainable home. "Miss Marple," she said, not quite warmly, "have you come to gloat? Everyone else seems to be. I've come for a cup of tea, if that's not too forward." Mrs. Hargrave blinked, then stepped aside. "I suppose we all need something to sip while we mourn the downfall of Basil Leighton," in the parlour as she stirred milk into her own cup. Miss Marple watched her movements, precise, habitual, not the movements of someone newly rattled. "Terrible business," Mrs. Hargrave said. "I never liked Leighton, to polished, the kind of man who knows the price of lies, but never how to arrange them, and yet you accepted his help, I believe, in dealing with your late husband's estate." A brief pause. "Once briefly," Cordelia recommended. "Him." Miss Marple sipped her tea, offered her sugar at the garden party. "Yes, reflex, I suppose." She never took Sue. Mrs. Hargrove's expression hardened. "Were you accusing me of something?" I'm taking note of what Miss Marple said, that someone dropped something into Cordelia's tea. but she didn't see it because she was so preoccupied with phoning Ivy about the bees. I think Mrs. Hargrave didn't respond. Instead, she kicked Crow out and got ready to remove Leighton. However, you were never mentioned in the trust, on the ledger, or in her will, with the exception of a small amount of £25 tied to a gardening society that she despised. After 30 years of friendship, Mrs. Hargrave whispered, "I feel like I owe you more. I was there for her through everything. When Thomas died, I came to that house every morning to organize her affairs. When Florence ran off to Brighton, I screened her callers and introduced her to Leighton, but she never once thanked me. Miss Marple said she simply thanked me. She never said, 'Please, continue.'" Mrs. Hargrave stood up suddenly, and I wondered if you had come here for a reason. Were you given a choice? Quietly, Miss Marple remarked the poison was derived from a crushed sedative, and the whereabouts of its purchaser will soon be revealed to the authorities. Your late husband was gazed at by Mrs. Hargrave. I remember you saying that once. Do you think a bottle went missing after his death? Mrs. Hargrave's fingers quivered. I didn't intend to murder her. I only wanted to scare, confuse, and shake her hold on that estate. Then Miss Marple rose, delicately retrieving her gloves from the side table. And Mrs. Hargrave, tell that to someone who takes notes in Chapter 10. On the morning that followed, Mrs. Fiona Hargrave sat solitary in the interview room of the police station, her hands delicately folded in her lap as if anticipating the arrival of tea. The air was heavy with quiet as the last constable left the room. Miss Marple watched from the corner as Rafferty sat across from her, pen poised on his notepad. Neither official nor challenged, Mrs. Hargrave glanced at the scratched tabletop. She reiterated, "I had no intention of killing her." "You crushed the pills." Rafferty whispered a yes and placed the pills into her tea. She took a quick puff. "I slipped the pills into her sugar, thinking she might use them. I'd noticed her behavior had changed, so I was worried she might use them. When she turned down the pill during tea, I freaked out and said, I offered it aloud, hoping she'd reach for it. She didn't. Fortunately, Reverend Merton handed her the cup before I could react, so the sedative had already dissolved. I suppose so, but I never intended for it to be fatal. It was just enough to make her laded, maybe stumble enough for others, to question her mental health, and Florence look incapable enough to cast doubt on her status as heir. You tampered with her drink, Rafferty stated in a harsh tone. She humiliated me, Mrs. Hargrave murmured. After 30 years of biting my tongue and stitching her name into charity registers and dinner place cards, I was her mirror. Sue, but she was always staring in her own direction. The police officer remained silent for a time before finally saying, Mrs. Hargrave, you must understand that your actions directly caused her death. I am now outside as the church bell rang at 11. Miss Marple and Rafferty stood beneath a thin, cloudy sky, and she felt intelligent. Rafferty mentioned that she possessed intelligence. Miss Marple could have come forward, but she was too stupid to think about the possibility that Cordelia would deviate from her usual routine, that she would see sugar but not touch it, and that the tea poured by one person and handed to another could still contain poison. After Rafferty's sluggish nod, Leighton plotted the cover-up, Crow managed the money, and Mrs. Hargrave was in charge of the house. Miss Marple delicately cupped her hands. Cordelia, layers of treachery, vanity, wrath, and bitterness culminated in Everly's death rather than a single act. After a lengthy silence, Rafferty finally spoke. Then there's going to be a trial. There always is, she stated. But the truth is already known. It only waits for paper and seal. "I read the piece," Miss Marple said. "It's in the Chronicle. They called it the Poisoned Legacy Poetic." Florence found her in her rose garden later that afternoon. With a tiny inaccuracy, Miss Marple murmured. Florence sighed. Her hands clenched. "Together, it's been a while since Aunt Cordelia's death. I was angry, scared, and puzzled. What hurts the most, though, is the realization of how many people disliked her, and how they loathed her quietly, as if they were preparing for it. Until it becomes second nature," Miss Marple said, "they keep it in a jar and work it into their daily routines." As Florence lowered her gaze, she thought, "I don't want this house. I'm not selling it. I'm not even going to live here. Maybe I can turn it into a care center or a reading retreat, something meaningful." That evening, as the sun set behind the hedgerows and the air turned to gold, Miss Marple grinned and stated that her legacy would be completely different. The last entry in Cordelia's journal was written by Miss Marple. Henry Crowe, alias Emery. Forbes, fraud, motive, and pressure were the two main suspects in the discovery of 70-year-old Evely's fall at tea. Third party responsible for Basil Layton's access concealment instigator. Fiona Hargrave, proximity method, resentment. Cordelia felt a shift and started to regain control. But she had made the error of assuming that politeness meant loyalty, when in fact the two rarely went hand in hand. She paused before adding, "Florence Everly cleared, shaken but intact. She will not repeat the cycle." She closed the journal. Gently outside the village exhaled its quiet evening breath. Windows glowing, kettles whistling, the day folding into stillness. In the distance, a pair of bees floated near the trellis, hovering where Cordelia's roses once bloomed. Defiantly, Miss Marple watched them for a moment, then turned down her lamp. Chapter 11, 3 days after. Mrs. Hargrove's confession and Basil Layton's arrest. The village of St. Hedwig's settled uneasily back into its routines. Curtains fluttered, church bells tolled, postman resumed delivering letters with mundane importance, but in the Dower House silence lingered. Florence stood in the morning light, at the base of the staircase, holding something small in her hand. A silver brooch, shaped like a bee, Cordelia's. It had fallen from her aunt's shawl that afternoon in the garden. Florence had found it days later, tucked beneath a rosebush root, the silver dulled, almost buried in the earth. She turned it over thoughtfully. It was heavier than it looked. Miss Marple arrived not long after, invited but unannounced. "I wasn't sure you'd come." As Florence guided her through the entry hall, she whispered, "You'll find I'm rather hard to deter, especially when tea is offered." They sat in the sunroom, where ivy pressed against the glass and Cordelia's best linens had been set out. This time, Florence spoke with confidence, saying, no trembling, no hesitation. "I'm glad it's over," but she also admitted, "but it still doesn't feel settled. It rarely does. I haven't told the cops everything, and justice is frequently silent and horribly imperfect." Without saying a word, Miss Marple patiently waited. Florence carefully removed a folded letter from her cardigan pocket, which was written on recognizable lilac stationery. "I discovered it hidden away in the last pages of the ledger, so neatly folded that I almost missed it." Miss Marple carefully examined it, and Florence returned the favor. "In the event that I am unable to weather this storm, you should be aware that I have never questioned your character, simply your preparedness. Initially, I considered waiting longer before returning to see what you have to offer, but now I realize that waiting is a form of control. I thought it was care that concluded now, but if something were to happen, I would have to confess what I never wanted to Jane Marple." The Lady Cordelia, Miss Marple, lifted the letter from her lap and studied it closely. She was sure she had, according to Florence, She was attempting to address the issue before it became critical, but others were more proactive. Although Florence wasn't always nice, she was making an effort, and she nodded. After delicately folding the letter once more, Miss Marple left behind the truth of rarity in her work, even while it remains unsaid. I am unsure of how to handle the fact that you are already that afternoon when most individuals pass away with good intentions. Cordelia, with a little bouquet of rosemary and sage, accompanied Miss Marple on her leisurely stroll to the graveyard. Miss Marple delicately brushed a fallen leaf from the name of Eve and placed the herbs on the soil, following in silence. She approached Reverend Merton, whose coat fluttered in the wind, and paused beside her, hesitating with a weary sigh. From that garden she ruled the village, and even when she wasn't there, he murmured something. She understood people's habits better than their hearts. They continued to stand for a second more before turning back to the lane, with Miss Marple asking, "Did I do something wrong?" "No, but you forgot about the tea and sugar when it mattered," Reverend Merton said abruptly. With a gentle voice, Miss Marple said, "We are all late to some truths." A single nod from him conveyed the message, no more. Once Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she numbered the last page of the small black journal that now included Cordelia's case in its entirety and wrote her final notes. The conclusion drawn by Miss Marple questioning in Dower House Leighton and Crow were afraid of being exposed, while Cordelia started to regain authority over her estate, suspecting financial exploitation. Ma'am Harrow, the Reverend, unwittingly set a trap when she poured Florence's tea, which relied on Cordelia's sporadic routine alterations, introducing poison and sedative via sugar. It is highly probable that Leighton attempted to erase evidence by removing the shattered cup. As soon as Florence found the ledger, the ivy began to unravel even faster. Kernow's observation demonstrated the importance of feeling motivated entitlement to resentment, apprehension regarding being exposed the right thing done. The three individuals involved discreetly retrieved and restored all crucial documents, including ledger entries, memorandums, letters, and inheritance records. No unsolved issues remained. The Dower House Trust for Independent Girls' Education, which was established in memory of Cordelia Evely and opened in the spring of 1956, was announced on the village bulletin board the following morning. Although Cordelia Evely was not liked, she was seen, and that might have been enough. Miss Marple's expression softened as she read it. By March, crocuses had broken through the soil surrounding the base of the Dower House, a sign that Florence had finally found a purpose for the house. The stone walls, which had been stiff with ivy and icy governance, now resounded with gentle laughter as girls practiced recitations in the drawing room and music lessons drifted from the old library. 15 young women were welcomed by Florence's soothing voice as she quietly summoned attendants along the entrance hall of the Dower House Trust. Clever, restless, undervalued, Cordelia's will amended before her death had specified its intent: education, autonomy, and no difference to family name or fortune. Florence greeted Miss Marple at the door on a Tuesday morning, her apron covered in chalk dust and a smudge of paint on her sleeve. "We're repurposing the solarium as an art studio," she announced as she led Miss Marple inside. "If you think Cordelia would have hated it, then you've made the perfect choice," Florence joked. They strolled through the garden that had once been Cordelia's parlor and conservatory, and on their way to the humble classroom from the old ledger room. Miss Marple was subtly taken aback by the fact that nothing had changed, not the wallpaper, not the rugs, not even the subtle aroma of Beneba. The air was different, lighter, and unguarded. You wanted to know what I'd do with the past, Florence explained, so I chose not to erase it. She then set a linen-covered box on the desk. There was a ledger inside the container, a picture of the Dower House from 1921, for ladies posed. On the steps, Cordelia's last letter, a silver bee brooch, and Florence's mother. You were correct about Cordelia, Emily, the governess, and the girl who had gone unremembered by the villagers until now. Florence said my mother worked here for years. Cordelia knew. That's why she watched me so closely, not for fear, but guilt, miss. Marple traced the photo's edge. She raised walls around her regrets. You've chosen not to. Florence nodded. I want these girls to live in a house where no one is afraid to speak a bold ambition with a smile on her face. Miss Marple made a rare purchase at the local baker. Later that day, while shopping at the greengrocer's, she stopped to chat with Ivy Kernow, who was sporting a new hat and a more elevated chin than she had in months. I didn't want it to be true. It frequently isn't from there. You were right. About the cup, Miss Marple whispered to her, the Cordelias didn't shatter by mistake. At the church, she paused to see Reverend Merton trim the rose bushes by the lysgate. He brushed dirt from his hands and added, they seem more forgiving. They shared a brief, companionable silence. She asked whether there would be a sermon today, and he said, only for the thorns. You've done a kindness, he finally told the hamlet, and all I could do was follow his lip. That evening, back at her cottage, Cordelia took care of the rest, according to Miss Marple. One final item was penned by Miss Marple in her black journal, which contained her views. When a woman dies in a Dower House, the last villagers don't alter drastically. Rather, they change little by little when other women decide not to carry on Cordelia's terror. It was Evely who sows control and dies alone. The murder was solved. The truth was unearthed, and something delicate has taken root. Florence Allen planted the seed of trust and opened the garden gates. Now, as dusk settled over the world outside her window, she closed the journal and placed it delicately on the shelf between the blue geranium case and the affair at the bungalow. The day was finally peaceful when Miss Marple lighted a single lamp, poured herself a cup of sugar-free plain tea, and cracked open a fresh novel.